Welcome to the Point. It's been more than 3 months since the general election, and still there are many people who believe there was fraud and irregularity in the process, though none has been proven. Still, Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson says it's important that people believe and participate in the election process, and to that end has introduced legislation she hopes might help. Secretary, first of all, thank you for doing this. This has been a tumultuous time to be the person in charge of elections, and there is so much we can talk about, and if time permits, we will. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is because you recently released a list, a pretty comprehensive list of changes that you would like to see made to election law. I'm going to go through some of these one by one and ask you about them, but overall, what was your purpose in coming up with this list of legislative items?
Well, as Candace Miller, one of my predecessors, once said, that the biggest room is the room for improvement. And so from my standpoint, moving forward off of last year's successful elections involves looking at the data, looking what worked and what didn't work. I mean, we had extraordinarily high turnout. More people voted than ever before in our state's history. It was a very secure election. And on top of all that, it happened in the midst of a pandemic. And so we want to review the data. And we reviewed the data, looked at what worked and what didn't. And from that, developed a plan of reforms that can continue to move us forward in ensuring that we repeat the successful election that we had on those metrics and address any challenges that emerged. And we know there were a few with regards to misinformation to ensure that we limit that effect in the future.
Before I move on to this legislative package, that's an interesting point because it was such, and the only word I can come up with is tumultuous, because it seemed that there was so much noise in and around and after the election. And here we are 3 months later, and there are still people that have questions in their mind about the election. Is this to help clarify going forward, making it clearer for people what the process is as well, so they understand why some of the things happen that happen?
Yes, I mean, we saw our most successful efforts to battle misinformation really emerge through voter education, through educating and preparing voters ahead of time of what to expect so that they knew what was true and what wasn't when efforts were launched to try to lie to voters. So that was something we saw that worked well. Of course, there was such an onslaught of misinformation following the close of the polls in November and throughout December. That was a significant challenge that we want to make sure does not become the norm, that we avoid those types of things in the future. And so our plan is really devised around 3 pillars. One, accessibility, making sure that our elections remain accessible to every citizen, every eligible voter, and building on our successes of last year to continue that. Secondly, infrastructure, making sure our clerks have all the support and resources they need to actually administer elections effectively and securely. And then third, election security and integrity, making sure that we counter misinformation and that we also continue to improve the security and integrity of the process.
Let's start with one of the things that you want to do, and that is you want to make sure that during, if I understand this right, just during the federal elections, so the presidential elections, you want to mail an absentee ballot application to everybody that's eligible to vote. That's kind of what you did in this past cycle, right?
Yes, we did. And it worked quite well, actually. We saw more people vote absentee than ever before. And it was really a voter education tool, which is a big theme of this package, to make sure all citizens know exactly if they choose their right, which they have a right in our Constitution to vote absentee, that they know exactly with clarity how to access that. And it also does 2 other things. One, there's a lot of political parties and candidates and even local clerks who will want to send out absentee ballot applications to registered voters. This policy will ensure that everyone gets one throughout the state, no matter where you live or what list you may or may not be on. So you have that equal access. Second thing it does is continually build in an effort to do mailings to our registered voter list, which hadn't been done in over a decade in our state. And that when we get returned addresses or feedback from people who receive those mailings, that helps us clean up the voter rolls. And that's something that we're doing right now. But it'll continually build in an effort to continually build and update our voter rolls through those mailings that serve both an educational and a security purpose.
And let me see if I understand that, because as you well know, and we certainly heard a lot about it, people in a lot of locations got that ballot application for somebody who no longer lived at an address. And from your perspective then, when somebody gets that, they should notify your office. But how confident are you that they do that?
Well, that's a voter education piece as well. We need voters to notify us or their local clerk, really. The local clerk is the one who can actually update the list appropriately. And it's one thing that we saw through the application mailing last year, that this list, the reason why that happened, where many people received an application, or a few people, and that voter had moved or was no longer in the state or was no longer eligible to vote, was because there hadn't been a mailing done in over a decade. And so that was, again, something that we learned throughout the process, and something that we want to improve moving forward, because that shouldn't happen. And this, builds in both an educational tool and that integrity tool all in one mailing. And then it will include clear instructions for citizens if they receive something that's not addressed to them, what to do with it.
We certainly have had our local clerks explain it, but I'm going to ask you to explain it again. If an absentee ballot application comes to someone's home and someone doesn't live there, and somebody else tries to fill it out and send it in, so not the right person, right? How do you catch that?
They will be breaking the law, and clerks will catch that through the signature match system. And this was actually caught a few times, people testing the system allegedly to see what would happen. And what happened was they broke the law, and law enforcement was contacted, and those cases are still working their way through the courts. But so essentially someone has to sign that application, and that application goes back to the clerk. When the clerk receives it, they look at the signature and they compare it to the signature on file that the voter signed when they registered to vote. If those signatures don't match, that's a flag for potential fraud that then gets investigated. And we have a system in place to ensure that that process happens. And then remember, that only gets the ballot sent to the voter. The voter then needs to sign the envelope outside the ballot, and that signature has to match the signature on file. And if it doesn't match, that ballot won't count. So there's those multiple protocols in place, and our work moving forward is to continue to fine tune those protocols to ensure voters know about them and clerks are fully prepared to implement them effectively.
Let's talk about one of the other things that you have proposed, and that is how and when those ballots can be counted. So if you have your ballot postmarked by Election Day, you suggest, and I'm going to read this so I get the verbiage correctly, that those received shortly after are counted. How much after the election would they be counted?
Well, I think that's where the sort of negotiation of the legislative package comes in. I'm open to insights from our clerks and from legislators about what that window should be. From my standpoint, the principle is if someone does everything right and mails their ballot in ahead of time, and they mail it prior to Election Day, and it's postmarked as such, they should not be disenfranchised through no fault of their own because the post office delivers their ballot late. And there's lots of states who have figured this out. In fact, a significant number allow those ballots postmarked prior to Election Day to count. And that also helps our military and overseas voters who similarly may mail something back. It may not, for whatever reason, get in prior to the deadline. Right now, even those overseas ballots have to be in prior to 8 p.m. on Election Day, and that ends up inadvertently disenfranchising a lot of citizens. And there's a solution for that this proposal would provide to ensure those voters don't get disenfranchised.
One of the things that I see as kind of a theme in here is that the election process would be greatly expanded from a time perspective. For example, as the guy who likes to go over to my big wall and say, okay, here are the election results and this is what we've got. This past cycle, I said, look, we don't know because there are so many absentee ballots that haven't been processed, and we may not know until Wednesday or Thursday or whenever. And if absentee ballots are allowed to be counted, what are you thinking, a week later or several days later?
Yeah, a couple things, and that's a great insight. You're absolutely right. There's the time is a factor here in a lot of different policies. We want actually the vast majority, the 99% of absentee ballots come in prior to long before even Election Day, although a lot come in on Election Day itself. So one of the proposals is to allow clerks to begin processing those ballots that come in early as they come in to increase efficiencies on Election Day. That helps get the results in sooner because the tabulation is able to be much more efficient as a result of that pre-processing. And then you will have a handful, this year it was a few thousand ballots, a few thousand statewide, by the way, out of millions, come in after Election Day but mailed in prior. And so building in a expectation or parameter or an infrastructure to make sure those ballots are still counted is an important part of transitioning to this new era era that we're in, where more people are going to be using the mail and voting absentee than ever before. Perhaps not as many as did last year because of the pandemic, but we can certainly anticipate that I think moving forward, at least half of our voters will be voting absentee. And so we need to adjust our laws appropriately to receive.
One of the other things you talk about is making early in-person voting possible and making Election Day a state holiday. But that would just be the day that the election is slated for. It feels like, and that's what happened this year, is the election was going on for weeks. I mean, this was a weeks-long process, and so making Election Day a holiday, we talk about the necessity for that, but so how early would you have early in-person voting?
Well, that's again, the details can be worked out through collaboration. I think looking at other states and best practices, a week or 2 weeks is certainly something that other states have embraced and voters have embraced quite well. I think in my view, the question has to be defined by what do voters want and what is voter behavior telling us? And what we know from last year is that a lot of voters chose to vote early. They chose to send in their ballots early. Those ballots simply couldn't be counted or tabulated until Election Day, which creates a lot of problems for efficiencies, but also if the voter makes an error and it's not caught until the ballot is tabulated on Election Day, they don't have an opportunity to correct that error, and perhaps they miss out on having their vote counted. So there's lots of reasons why enabling the tabulation of those ballots or early voting to happen in a week or 2 weeks or even a few days prior to Election Day can be really helpful for ensuring every valid vote is counted. And then on the Election Day piece, making Election Day a holiday, you're absolutely right. Most people are now, and certainly last year, voted prior to Election Day. So it actually wouldn't affect the voting process. All the data shows that the only impact that would have is twofold. One, more people would have the day off on Election Day, and so they could perhaps work the elections, serve as a poll worker. That's something that was a significant need that we filled last year, but this would help us fill it in future years. And it also puts Election Day in sort of this preeminent place in our culture, as it should be, as a holiday is, as something that we celebrate and are engaged in multiple different ways, which is especially enabled if people are voting absentee or early ahead of time, and then can use Election Day itself to help ensure that ballots are tabulated effectively and all other things work, and it becomes more of a community thing.
This may not be a concern, but it's something I think about. If you start counting those ballots early, and if any of that information were to become public, it could have an impact, and I don't know how to gauge what that impact could be, but if people started seeing early returns, that could have an impact on an election. How do you make sure you keep that stuff bottled up?
Well, I think two things. I mean, one, we can look to the other states who do that, and a lot of other states do have that tabulation prior to Election Day, and it's able to be done securely by simply ensuring that there's secrecy sleeves that are required to protect the ballot from being viewed, and then you put the ballot in the machine without even flipping it or seeing any votes, and then the machines don't release the data until Election Day or until the polls close. So there's ways to, and other states have done this, to protect the security of the process. There's laws you can put in place to provide real strong ramifications. The other thing to remember is that a lot of that data is also still able to be figured out based on the public data of simply who's voting. And so campaigns have already figured out in some ways how to track who's voting and any potentially early patterns based on just simply who's voting, what communities are voting absentee, and that is already available. So we have to sort of look at those two things, but note that there are security provisions in place to make sure that the specific vote tabulations don't get released until after the polls close.
And so there is always the political aspect of this, and as you well know, the Republican-controlled legislature would have to join with you on this. The chairman of the Ethics and Elections Committee over in the House said after this was released that, and I'm going to read this quote verbatim, if her, meaning your, goal is to truly work together in a bipartisan manner, I can't imagine why she would continue to bring up emotionally charged policy proposals that have already been struck down by the courts. I don't know which of those she is referring to, but it sounds as if you may have your political fight cut out for you. Have you talked with any of the Republicans about the prospect of getting some of these to become a reality?
Yes, I have. And it's notable that some Republican legislators have already introduced legislation. Eric Nesbitt has introduced legislation to adjust the primary election date, which is part of this package. So I'm grateful for those lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who are taking a thoughtful approach to the data-driven policies that we've proposed. And it's disappointing to me that any lawmaker would react in sort of a knee-jerk way to assume that something is, because it's proposed by someone who has a D after their name as I do, that something is somehow unable to be bipartisan or collaborative, which this package of legislation very much is presented with that intention and with that hope. And so I've been grateful again for the lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who received it in that way and are similarly looking at the data, talking to their clerks, and seeing a lot of overlap. And I'm confident at the end of the day, we'll see a lot of these provisions come into the law.
As indicated by the release I read part of, the Secretary of State's legislative package is likely to face a good deal of skepticism in the Republican-controlled legislature. When we come back, the next big election and why it will look different. To the point. Welcome back to the Point. Every 10 years, there's a new census. Following that, new congressional, state, Senate, and House districts are drawn. That process is going on now, but it is a process unlike any that we've seen before in Michigan. Let's move on to another subject, and this one affects everybody in the state just as elections do, and that's redistricting. And I want to go back a little bit to another election when the idea was brought up of having a commission of non-elected people instead of the 110 members of the House and the 38 members of the Senate who drew up redistricting lines for decades, once every 10 years when the census comes out, and instead put it in the hand of a commission. And that's what happened. The people voted on it. That commission has been selected. You can talk about the makeup of that in just a minute, but talk to me a little bit about that process that's ongoing now and how different it looks. And if I may quickly, I said this to the organizers when this election was going on. I thought they had a genius commercial that showed the state of Michigan with these perfect little square boxes for all these districts all across the state. And I said to them now, and I say to you now, them then and you now, there aren't going to be a bunch of perfectly square little boxes. That's not it can't be done that way. But tell me about the process.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think the goal is to find the middle ground where, obviously perfection's not the enemy of the good, but where we don't see the type of blatant partisan-driven gerrymandering that we have in our state legislative and congressional district maps right now. And I'm incredibly inspired and confident in the work of these 13 citizens who are randomly selected through this very meticulous process. Nearly 10,000 citizens applied to be a member of the commission, and we hope many of those will now join in submitting maps, which all citizens we want to be able to do, because this commission's job is to now listen to every voter in the state about what they want their districts to look like. And so the work now is for voters, for citizens all across the state to say, what do I want my district to look like? Draw a district and submit it to the commission for consideration, or draw a statewide map, or weigh in on maps that others have drawn. That's the process now. And what's given me a lot of faith in this process is that every Thursday, the commissioners meet in an open meeting. Anyone could watch it. It's at redistrictingmichigan.org. You can find out about past meetings as well. And you can actually watch the process work, where you have these very committed Republicans, Democrats, and independents who are from all across the state, who are laser focused on simply just ensuring that the process works, recognizing their place in history, and also their immediate responsibility to draw fair maps for the people of the state.
Do we know what numbers we're dealing with? Do we know how many people need to be in each of those districts for the state house and the state senate and the U.S. House seats?
It's ultimately going to be determined by the census numbers. And that's really the biggest challenge at this moment. I mean, just today, the U.S. Census Bureau said it may not be until September that data is given to our state. And under state law, November 1st, those districts need to be done. So what we may see if that data truly isn't delivered on time, and it actually is supposed to be delivered right now to our commission, then we may need to adjust additional deadlines moving forward. But the bottom line is we need that data to come in and to be accurate so that the commissioners can begin answering those questions and identifying exactly how many and in what way districts should and could be drawn. But they're using this time right now to learn and to talk to experts and to build a staff that's going to make sure they can hit the ground running whenever that data does come in.
We, as we always do, are going to run out of time. So two things quickly. Is it your anticipation that the population shift in the state will be great enough that we may lose a congressional district? And secondly, do you have any concerns about kind of some big gaps. For example, where we live here in West Michigan, we have one representative on that commission from Battle Creek, another one from Reed City, and nothing in between. Should that be a concern?
Well, it would be a concern if no one from the areas in between now participate in the process. The real opportunity now is for everyone, from elected leaders to everyday citizens, to participate in this process and tell those commissioners directly, all 13 of them, what you want to see in West Michigan, what you want those districts to look like. They will be different. The state house, state senate, and congressional districts will change significantly, I believe, than they are right now. And the best way to ensure your views are a part of that determination and that difference is to speak up, get engaged, and know that the people on this commission desperately want to hear from you and respond to you and integrate your views into the maps that they will ultimately draw and put into law. So get involved now, stay involved throughout the year. It's an incredible time for all of us to make sure that our maps in Michigan reflect the citizens' views. And
the first part of that question, and you may not know because I don't know if you've got preliminary data, but there is your thought process that we may end up with one less representative in Washington?
That's certainly the prediction. That's certainly what it appears to be. And of course that's what's happened consistently for the past few decades now. So we will probably move in that direction as well, which then creates even more potential changes for the next round of maps.
And finally, this process will all be done, the districts will be delivered, and somebody somewhere is going to object. When does this all have to be settled, the final date? When will we really know what those districts look like? Well,
current state law would say November. But even just today, there's a lot of moving pieces with the pandemic that may cause that to be delayed. I mean, we know in November of 2022, there will be a federal election out of these districts. And next summer in 2022, there will be a primary out of these districts. And so a lot of the other the dates beyond that are in flux. Although traditionally we would have maps by this November, I would hope that that can still be the case, but we want to prioritize citizen input. And if we don't have a lot of space between when the data comes to the state and when those maps are drawn, that minimizes the time for citizens to have input, and we don't want to do that. So I think we're going to see in the months ahead a lot of discussions about how that timeline is going to go. And I'm sure the legislature will weigh in on that as well, because it may require, or the courts, to adjust some of those deadlines.
Secretary Benson, the final question for this interview is this. It has been a rough election cycle. I know that there have been challenges and questions and all of those things that have come up. The elections have been certified. Everybody has taken their offices. Are there still outstanding challenges that your office is still dealing with from 2020?
Well, yes, I would say there's still remnants of the 2020 election that we all have a responsibility to address. A lot of this legislative package is a reflection of lessons learned, as I mentioned, and work we need to do to ensure everyone has faith that their vote counts and their democracy is secure. And so that's going to be something we focus on moving forward. But the bottom line is, in my view, we have a responsibility, all of us on both sides of the aisle, every elected leader, to tell the truth to every voter in this state that their votes did count, the results of the election were accurate, and the audits that are happening right now throughout the state are affirming that as well. And so that work will continue. It's very important work to do because people should believe the truth, that their votes counted, the results were accurate, and we're all going to have to continue to do that work in the months ahead so that we keep our democracy intact and make sure all voters have faith in the process, because there's more elections coming down the line and we need everyone to be participating in them.
When those new redistricting lines are finally settled, there will likely be some big changes in your representation, and some lawmakers may find they no longer live in the district they represent. We'll keep following that. And when we come back, a final thought to the point. So after a contentious election and aftermath, is it possible to convince those who still question the outcome that coming elections are secure? That will be a story that we will continue to follow. See you next week. To the point.